Professor Settis is Professor Emeritus of History of Art and Classical Archaeology at, Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa. Past director of the same school, and for 5-6 years director of the Getty Museum in USA. As Professor Livi-Bacci is member of our academy, of the Accademia Nazionale dei Lincei, of Academy of Art and Science, and so on. Please.
Thank you so much. Dear President of ALLEA, dear President of this Accademia delle Scienze, I'm very grateful to Massimo Mori for inviting me to speak in our present context today about the role of European academies in preserving cultural heritage. A very controversial subject matter that requires first some articulation about the challenges we are actually facing. As a matter of fact, not just professionals, but also public intellectuals and politicians from several countries in Europe and elsewhere widely discuss the role of cultural heritage, including museums and exhibitions, within changing contexts and against quite disparate historical, social, and cultural backgrounds. More often than not, though, we used to take it for granted that the notion of cultural heritage is more or less solidly established, and that museums, for instance, are well-grounded institutions firmly devoted to widely accepted socio-cultural practices. We seem to believe, apparently, that such socio-cultural practices, like, say, conservation or exhibitions, might be perhaps discussed, improved sometimes, worsened some other times, through what we do, but are nevertheless a basically unchangeable element of our cultural landscape. It is therefore, I believe, highly important for us today to remind ourselves that everything belonging to the very notion of cultural heritage is by its very nature temporary and vulnerable. Let's take as a very eloquent case in point the main institution of cultural heritage, namely the museum. Actually, the museum is a cultural creation, and indeed a very recent one. However we might define its genealogy and current status, the public museum as an institution, as opposed to royal or private collections, is not older than 1734, when the Capitol Museum in Rome was founded by Pope Clemens XII, while the enormous collections at the Vatican, just like the royal collections in Paris or London, weren't open to the general public. Just let's think about one small data. Around 1820, there were no more than 30 museums worldwide, all in Europe. Now museums are at least 55,000 in more than 200 countries. And now, if we think in those terms, let's think also in other terms which are related. Every institution produced by human societies that has a beginning, like the museum, at some point in time, might well, sooner or later, have an end. To put it differently, to a birth date of all cultural creations, from, say, epic poetry to representative democracy, necessarily corresponds a potential expiration date. It is only in this context, the possibility that museums and care for cultural heritage would die one day, that it makes sense to discuss some recent developments in this world. Let me start by mentioning a few among the several points that are currently under discussion on a broader scale throughout the intense debate about the very nature of cultural heritage. The points I will mention fall into 5 general categories: definition, relevance, function, ownership, costs. First, definition. How should we mark the limits of cultural heritage? Does it exclusively pertain to various forms of art, however defined, or should it include objects or documents relating to history, religion, technology, medicine, craftsmanship, society, agriculture, industrial organization, and so forth and so on? To what extent do museums represent a significant cross-section of the cultural heritage of a country, of a city, of a geocultural area, of a country? Which is the right balance between what part of the cultural heritage is preserved in public collections and what is privately owned, or between what belongs to museums and what is fortuitously scattered through churches, palaces, public areas, institutional and private buildings in a city like Turin, for instance. Second point, relevance. And as you see and will see, I'm just listing a number of question marks to keep in mind for my further discussion. What is, on the point of relevance, or rather should be, the meaning of cultural heritage in contemporary society, i.e. in our age, obsessively dominated by the rhetoric of globalization? Should we look for a global definition or standards of protection of cultural heritage worldwide? Or should we instead aim at different cultural standards in each country or even in individual areas, the West and the East, for instance, according to their distinctive cultural traditions? Does a given country's cultural heritage apply only to what one finds in that particular region, British culture in the UK, Italian culture in Italy, and so forth? Or should we pursue a more general definition of its meaning and relevance on a worldwide scale? Should we strive, for instance, in Europe, for common shared criteria on how to locate and foster cultural heritage, and particularly museums, within political and cultural preoccupations? Or should we rather leave its role and relevance to the fluctuating choices and policies of individual governments in individual countries? Third point, function. What should we do with cultural heritage? Should we regard it as a depository of historical memory or of cultural identity? Difficult word today. Is it accordingly integral to the notion of nationality, or should it belong instead to a multinational European identity, if there is one, or else to mankind as a whole? How do we assess the nature and status of cultural heritage before the invention of the very concept of nation and of the nationalisms involved? Should we preserve the objects of cultural heritage forever and therefore set what is cultural heritage very clearly apart from what is not? How to do this? And if we choose to preserve something because it is labeled as cultural heritage, should its function be merely aesthetic pleasure, or rather historical, archival information, or else directed at implementing the education of next generations? Fourth point, ownership. Who owns cultural heritage, however defined? Does it belong to the public or to the private sphere, or both? Does the private owner of a historical mansion or of an important painting, for instance, have the right to destroy it, or not? Can the government or public administration of a state, a city, a public agency of any sort, including European institutions, limit the rights attached to the status of private property in order to protect a piece of cultural heritage, or not? To what extent do privately owned museums fall in the same category as the public ones? How much does the genealogy of a given museum affect our ability to keep or change the norms and the rules of the game? For instance, for museums originating in royal collections and for those who are not. Fifth category, and last, costs. preserving cultural heritage, and particularly museums, can be very expensive. If one decides to preserve a building, such as the Colosseum in Rome, let me take this as an example, which has lost, probably forever, its original function and has indisputably earned the cultural heritage label, who should cover the costs? Should one expect visitors to do it, as is actually the case for the Colosseum, or should the state do it? What is if there are not enough visitors to cover the costs, as very often happens with most museums and monuments? Why should governments spend public money on them? Should they spend it on all of them? Or would it be more sensible to identify a limited number of monuments and museums and collections to preserve and then leave the rest to their own fate, whatever it may be? Would selling or loaning monuments and museums to private owners or companies who may be willing to take care of them be a good solution? Temporary or permanent? Would private rather than public management of cultural heritage be more effective and perhaps less expensive or not? Under what conditions, if any, might privatization of public monuments and museums be considered in government's policies? Now I'm ending with this very long series of question marks because I wanted to make clear that in order to address such a complex constellation of problems, we need an equally complex constellation of disciplines and of competences, something that academies, actually in Europe as well as elsewhere, do actually possess more, in a sense, than university. And this is more or less equally true for the environment, as we have heard this morning. In this sense, I think that we also should think about networking of our European academies in a broader sense. While we usually think about the academies as discrete, individual, distinct institutions, we individually belong to more than one of them. As Pietro just mentioned a minute ago, to take me as an example, I'm not exemplary, of course, but just for sake of time, I belong also to other Italian academies, as mentioned. I also belong to the Institut de France or to the Berlin-Brandenburgische Akademie der Wissenschaften, and so forth. So we have multiple points of view. We should be able to put together, and I think that ALLEA in this respect is already a big step forward. We should think about our academies, about the ability to encourage and foster interdisciplinary or metadisciplinary research. Universities are sometimes reluctant, particularly in Italy, to break disciplinary boundaries because they are bound to stay within a given department, fighting against other disciplines in order to have more funding. Academies, by their very nature, gather diverse competencies under the same roof. They, the academies, i.e. we here today, have a great potential for moving from reactive to proactive, from gathering competencies to generating ideas and projects. And what I'm saying, I'm inspired by what several people said. I want only to mention here Padua Schioppa, what he said yesterday. I didn't mention so far, as perhaps I should have, a number of other issues, of course. Among them, to name but a few, the balance between large museums and small local museums, or the controversial balance between permanent collections and exhibition policies. Though, before coming to the possible role of European academies in the highly problematic and edgy context I am sketching, let me dwell on a very important point that deeply affects this entire discussion, i.e. the increasingly dominant conception of cultural heritage as primarily an economic asset, which we may or be bound to exploit accordingly. Such an argument is, on one hand, one of the many signs of the global emphasis on money and finance we experience on a daily basis worldwide. On the other, it is also a clear symptom of the shaky and fragile status of cultural heritage in our world. In this respect, whatever happens or will happen in Europe is extremely important because it necessarily takes on an unparalleled institutional and political relevance. So it is in Europe that the very idea of cultural heritage was born. It is in Europe that the very idea of museum and, as an institution of norms about cultural heritage were born a long time ago. So whatever happens in Europe might have a great value worldwide. One of the many paradoxes we are living through in the early 21st century is that protection of cultural heritage simultaneously increases in some countries, decreases in other countries. Why? It does actually increase in a number of emerging countries, from Latin America to Africa, where it is considered integral to a country's cultural identity, political self-awareness, economic development. And as part of this process, the more local governments choose to protect their own cultural heritage at large, however defined, the more an increasing number of objects of archaeological or artistic value move into local museums. The same countries where more often not there was historically no tradition of special laws for the protection of cultural heritage gradually adopt some form of public enforcement, sometimes even at the level of their constitutions. Interestingly, such developments, another point to think about, normally happen within a post-colonial and non-Eurocentric culture, yet they are quite often invariably modeled after European patterns. This gives us a much stronger responsibility for the future generations worldwide. In some sort of reverse symmetry, however, and to a certain extent counterintuitively, countries where historically the tradition of law enforcement of different forms of protection of cultural heritage is older and more firmly established, such as Italy and most of Europe, are developing right now some sort of a conflicting conception whereby the main, if not the only reason for protecting cultural heritage is its monetary value rather than spiritual value or educational or aesthetic meaning. As a consequence, even in a country like Italy, which has been the first worldwide to include the protection of cultural heritage and landscape among the basic principles of its 1948 constitution, every step in the process of protection of cultural heritage, funding of museums and so forth, must increasingly be negotiated with politicians and argued for as something that may be deemed tendentially optional, if not altogether superfluous. It would perhaps be not entirely misleading, I think, to argue that the same driving force, i.e. the market, dictates both developments. It operates, however, quite differently from place to place. On one hand, developing countries recently enforced laws to protect cultural heritage in order to limit the damage caused by exportation of their archaeological goods, for instance. In other countries, and let me take again Italy as an example, laws protecting cultural heritage have enabled us over time the preservation of an impressively large public patrimony. Yet, unfortunately, its monetary value increasingly takes precedence in Italian policies, to the point that sometimes even its public guardians, ministers, for instance, who are supposed to act for the public good, end up caring more about exploiting rather than preserving monuments, and therefore essentially weaken the very norms and survival of preservation. If we keep in mind the very demanding questions I just outlined, let's ask ourselves within the context of today's conference, which could or should be the role of European academies towards these challenges. I will now gather a few possible answers around three bywords: dissemination, reflection, transmission of knowledge. It is a truism to remind an audience such as this one that traditionally European academies played and still play an extremely important, indeed essential role in encouraging, promoting, leading research projects in every possible field, including all those pertinent to cultural heritage. Yet we should also focus on an equally important aspect of their, i.e. of our work in this respect, namely the dissemination of knowledge once it is gathered and accredited by the authority and reputation of a well-established academy such as this one. Let me mention 3 examples, all launched by different academies in different countries in the 19th century and still alive. Among the many merits of the Preußische, now Berlin-Brandenburgische Akademie der Wissenschaften, one of the most relevant is undoubtedly the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, a gigantic undertaking going on from 1847 to the present, whereby several thousands of inscriptions from all over the Roman Empire, extremely useful for the social and political history of Europe, were and still are collected, analyzed, and critically published in a large number of perfectly organized and printed volumes. And this is something like similar to the Monumenta Germania Historica mentioned yesterday by Padua Schioppo. In Italy, the Accademia Nazionale dei Lincei started in 1876 the series of Notizie degli scavi di antichità, still going on, where a number, not all, of archaeological findings and excavations in Italy are duly examined and published. In France, the Compte Rendu de l'Académie des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres, regularly printed since 1857, keep ever since publishing a wealth of learned papers on matters mostly pertaining to culture, memory, and heritage. And I'm quite sure that while I was very rapidly mentioning these 3 examples, everyone in this room had other, and perhaps even better, examples in mind. Evidently, though, it is highly important for European academies to pursue, today and tomorrow, the very same objective by rigorously and systematically gathering on the highest scholarly level documents and comments of different sorts relating to cultural heritage and memory. Yet we should also ask ourselves, to what extent, in the context of the mass culture of the 21st century, European academies are doing enough or not in this respect, in order to effectively share with the general public the nature, the relevance, the potential impact of our continued effort focusing on cultural heritage. In other words, the question mark I'm putting forward now is, shouldn't we think more about whether to imagine our mission of dissemination on 2 different yet converging levels and languages, i.e. scholarly accuracy for specialized researchers on one hand, and the ability to reach a more general public of citizens on the others? Second byword, reflection, i.e. the duty for every individual academy, but also for a gathering of academies such as ALLEA to actively contribute, as we are doing right now, to the intellectual debate about cultural heritage and its different functions. This is, as should be evident from my general argument, a very hot topic, where the hierarchy of values, for instance, economic worth versus ethical or aesthetical merits, deserves not just a generic attention, but careful analysis that must be based on solid conceptual ground. All the various components summoned by the very idea of cultural heritage and its historical precedents and determinations should be conveniently brought together in such a discussion. And our academies, with a wide spectrum of competences, they are able to gather together from law to art, history, from sociology to archaeology, and so forth, are ideally placed to make such a discussion advance. Again, with an eye to a highly scholarly, sophisticated level, yet another eye directed at the general, non-specialized public. That, very importantly, also includes most decision makers within governments and parliaments. The transmission of knowledge is my third byword, is very much linked to what Loprieno was mentioning yesterday, providing orientation. Transmission of knowledge means that our academy are ideally placed also to act as a repository of wisdom and a laboratory of thought about the role cultural heritage should play, subject as our societies currently are to a loss of historical and cultural memory and of the values connected with it. It is therefore highly important for our academies to focus very carefully on how to involve new generations, fortunately well represented in this room now, in the endeavor of keeping alive Europe's cultural memory. Academies do have a genetic code, a long history that might ask as guardian of cultural memory, and therefore we can conveniently provide an effective framework where to contrast one of the main pathologies of our time, i.e. the continuous obsession with the present, what we may call, with the French word, presentism, perfectly, if early described, or rather diagnosed by T.S. Eliot. Let me quote from him in an essay of 1944, a really prophetic one. In our age, I'm quoting, when men seem more than ever prone to confuse wisdom with knowledge and knowledge with information, there is coming into existence a new kind of provincialism, which perhaps deserves a new name. It is the provincialism not of space, but of time, one for which history is merely the chronicle of human devices which have served their turn and been scrapped, one for which the world is the property solely of the living, a property in which the dead hold no shares. The menace of this kind of provincialism is that we can all the people of the globe, be provincials together. And those who are not content to be provincials can only be hermits. So far, T.S. Eliot in 1944. What I'm suggesting, in other words, is that the new name for Eliot's provincialism in time is precisely presentism, a trend our academies should strongly oppose. Let me now briefly conclude by mentioning a few final points that would obviously deserve further discussion. First, the very nature of cultural heritage, including its portion preserved in museums, is neither about conserving or showing art objects, but about making citizens of every age and of every country think and reflect upon them. Objects of cultural heritage, from potsherds to cathedrals, work as thought-provoking mechanisms, and therefore they need to be seen within very large contexts, a context that only education in schools can provide. Our academies should therefore plead for a central role of historical disciplines in European schools of every age and sort. Lack of basic contextual information within society at large only makes cultural heritage largely ineffective and tends to transform its main objects and adjust them into a sort of quasi-superstitious adoration of a very few emblematic icons, the Parthenon, Leonardo, the Sistine Chapel, and all the rest can be destroyed. Also the pyramids. Moreover, we should properly wonder whether the marginalization of cultural heritage in public investment policies, as we experience it in various forms throughout Europe, doesn't ultimately rest on a basic lack of awareness of its function among the policymakers as well as within the society at large. Our academies in Europe should therefore foster initiatives aimed at better defining such a function and make it more widely known. We should be able to persuasively and forcefully argue that cultural heritage in museums and elsewhere historically operated and still operates for a purpose, i.e. for making us think about art and culture of the past in order to draw from it energy for the future. Art and culture, in this conception, are primarily about citizenship, i.e. about full awareness of our collective cultural memory as an essential ingredient of democracy. If this is true, our academies should also seriously think about the pressing, yet altogether unnoticed risk of our time, namely the institutionalization of cultural heritage, if we conceive it as something separate from normal life. Signs of this tendency are the increasingly common transferring of whatever is of artistic value from streets and piazzas, churches and palaces into museums. Think only of the Marcus Aurelius on top of the Capitol, which is now substituted by a very bad copy and brought in the interior of the museum in the same piazza. And even large cities are sometimes transformed into museum-like showcases. Slowly, inconspicuously, we get used to talk about entire cities, such as Venice or Florence, as città museo, museum cities. Yet we should firmly keep in mind that cities are definitely not museums. The real issue is not how to experience a city as if it were a museum, but rather how to make museum a dynamic part of the city, of the urban fabric. How can such a goal be achieved? We are currently experiencing in Europe a double movement. On the one hand, a general movement toward the establishment of more and more museums everywhere. On the other hand, museums themselves are constantly evolving, sometimes into shopping centers, other times into places for entertainment, hence the neologism edutainment, to the point that historic cities can be seen and experienced as playful theme parks, hence the Disneyification of Venice, of which everybody speaks today. We therefore found ourselves today at a very important juncture, that between the cultural heritage as entertainment and the cultural heritage as thought, experiment, and token for citizenship. And I think academies should analyze this contradiction. Let me now end my talk by coming back to my starting point. While we normally take the very existence of something called cultural heritage as a given, we should keep in mind that museums and the very notion of cultural heritage are a relatively new formation, a historical concretion of a long process that may well come to an end, perhaps even sooner than we expect. Their function, if deprived of cultural memory and contextual awareness, will inevitably become less and less clear, a process that, to my mind, is already on its way. Not just museums, entire historic cities will be mistaken as a form of attraction among many. And this is unavoidable as long as we are unable to consider them integral to the city and its life, rather than separate from it. Cultural heritage must converse with the city, be grafted onto its patrimonial, civil and social fabric, even museums. It should be considered as distillation of historical sedimentation and collective memory. In a present like ours, obsessively fixed on itself and afflicted by a growing cultural amnesia, cultural heritage can and must be a medicine for our memory. The past, as in the title of a famous book by David Lowenthal, is really a foreign country and can give us, as we see it alive in the very cities we inhabit, the experience of diversity, of complexity, of a collective cultural memory. The urban crowds, including the public of museums, should be the determining agent of this social-cultural process. And I end with a quotation by a text of the 30s, of the 1930s, by Georges Bataille. The rooms of the museum and its art objects are but a container. The real content of a museum, for instance, of the Museo Egizio today, is the public of visitors. A museum is like the lung of a big city. The crowd flows in it like blood and comes out purified and fresh. The paintings are only dead surfaces, It is within the crowd that sparkle the games, the clamor, the lights before the authorized critics describe them with their technical language. Now we are among the authorized critics. As owners and guardians of technical languages, the European Academies, I believe, are bound to enhance and develop not just their mission of generating ideas out of competencies and research, but also to develop our ability to continuously converse about cultural heritage with the increasing urban crowds of our own time. Whether this would imply changing the mission, perhaps the very nature of our academies, it's for us or for you to decide. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Salvatore. Questions? Professor Loprieno.
Well, thank you very much, Salvatore. And since you asked directly what the academies can do, so I react spontaneously with one particular concern or experience that I have precisely in thinking about these issues. And that is what I might describe generally as a possible conflict between cultural heritage and the needs of research. And I would give you perhaps two examples of specific experiences that I had at two universities of my country that I know quite well, the University of Zurich, the University of Basel, in precisely an issue of cultural heritage, where the opposition to cultural heritage came from the needs of research, thus from a constituency that academies also have to consider. At the University of Zurich, there used to be a now closed museum for the history of medicine. And it was a public's magnet. This institute had problems of human nature. When the problems of human nature were solved, the institute was closed. And the institute was closed because the department in charge of this museum, which was the Department of Cultural Studies, said there should be no museum of the history of medicine, because a museum of history of medicine is an image of an understanding of cultural heritage that is not ours now. That is a kind of 19th century model. Now we don't show up skeletons and mummies around. This is a different understanding. So not only we shouldn't keep it up, but we are going to close it most definitely. The second example of a conflict between research and culture, if we're going to put it that way, I experienced at the University of Basel when it was decided to build a new structure for the Department of Chemistry. And this new structure used to be in the place called Bernoulianum, where the famous Bernoulli taught. And the decision was, of course, we are going to tear down the dam building of Bernoulli, which we don't need, and we are going to build a building that corresponds to the needs of top-notch research in chemistry. Again, polarization between two parties. We should keep the Bernoulli room. We should tear down the Bernoulli room and defend the needs of research of the University of Basel, not the need of the cultural heritage of. So, what is your and I mention these two examples because these are two examples that emerge within the academies themselves in trying to promote this type of research. So, what would be your recommendation there? Which of the two sides? There's the issue of how to select cultural heritage and how to have a dynamic understanding of cultural heritage, that not all which 50 years ago was considered worthy of being kept is considered worthy of being kept or displayed 50 years later.
Thank you very much. Indeed, this is a very good, you raised a very important question, which should also be, does it work? Can you hear me? You raised a very important question that is linked with the general movement I mentioned. All the international organization about museums, there are more than one, they are counting the number of, the increasing number of museums. They refrain from counting the increasing number of museums that close for different reasons. And let me add another reason to what, and another phenomenon that is particularly clear in the United States, the repatriation phenomenon. A number of museums about American Indians, American Indian culture have been closed because American Indian tribes, the more gain space in political, on political scenario in the US, they claim back the bones of their ancestors. So they want the bones of their ancestors to be spread around. They don't want them to be transferred from one museum, let's say in Washington, D.C., to their own museum in Arizona. They wanted the bones to spread, and even the potsherds I have seen. I visited many of those places. I have seen archaeological sites in Arizona and Utah and so forth, where you go there are no visitors and millions of potsherds on the soil. You might collect whatever you want. I didn't do it, but I'm sure that many people would. So I think that the mechanisms by which museums might be closed is also to be examined. And what happened in Zurich is only an example of this. The Bernoullianum example is also useful in another respect, i.e. the very controversial nature of what is really cultural heritage. Our need to make choices continuously is something that should we give preference to the historic value of a building, even the building, if the building is collapsing, should we restore it, or should we rather tear it down and build something else in its place in order to build something better or more functional and so forth. So this is a point that is very differently addressed by different European countries, because our laws are very different. Italian law is very protective, but increasingly less so. Other countries are much less protective. In the British Isles, we all know how much people from the UK, be they English or Scots, are protecting cultural heritage. They have a great cultural protection of cultural heritage. Yet, between after World War I, no less than 1,500 historic villas in England and Scotland have been destroyed by their owners in order to do something economically more interesting for them. So in Italy this would have been impossible, but in Italy we have hundreds of villas, for instance in Veneto, that are there, not really used. Sooner or later will we find a way of reusing them in some way. They cannot all become museums. This is quite impossible. We should elaborate what I would call a poetic of reuse of historical buildings, but we weren't able to do it so far. Should our academies be contribute to this or not? I don't know.
I very much appreciated your contribution about the scientific and cultural integration for the protection, conservation of cultural heritage. I would like to underline the contribution of science and techniques, even at the engineering level, and you had a prominent role in the conservation of Leaning Tower of Pisa, so you know very well this subject. I will underline this aspect in 10 days in the opening lecture at the opening of the academic year here at the Academy of Science of Turin. Italy, in effect, has to face this problem, being the largest container of cultural heritage and being at the same time a seismic, very vulnerable region. So the contribution of science is generally important. In Italy is very important for the double reason, seismic action, and also the centuries go by, and so this cultural heritage becomes older and older. I would like to have your opinion on this.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for mentioning the Tower of Pisa project, which I consider the best professional experience of my life. Because we were basically 14 people, international, from different countries, from the US to Belgium or Germany and so forth, including, of course, Italy. And we were asked by the Italian government to find a way of reducing the inclination of the Tower of Pisa in order to prevent its falling down, which we did. But we started, it took about 9 years to come to a real solution. Most of us were engineers, and they were both geotechnical engineers and structural engineers. The geotechnical engineers had a family of solutions. The structural engineers had another family of solutions. We at art historians had another family of preoccupations, namely to keep the integrity of the monument as a medieval building, not transforming it into an artificial thing as we can build it in Las Vegas. So we started from different cultures, and eventually we came up with a very good solution, which reduced eventually the inclination of the tower by 10% without actually touching the monument itself. I'm not in a position to explain it now. You know it very well, but I already did a lecture once from this very desk to a different audience. So I think that in this respect, integration between different competencies is absolutely necessary for the preservation of cultural heritage. Now, instead of thinking of it only as something that we need in emergency, like the Tower of Pisa, in order to prevent its falling, why don't we think of this integration as something that could be integral to the role of our academies and to their very mission, their very organization? We don't do it enough, I think.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, Professor Settis, thank you very much of this really very important lecture with pointing to the main problems we have today with cultural heritage and so on. To me, I just want to add something and ask you what is your opinion about. I think the main problem is the relationship between politicians and culture. So this is my impression from my German experience. For instance, you know that in Berlin we built a new museum, we built a new castle for the extra-European cultures. And in the first period, so this castle was supposed to be a museum for the extra-European cultures. But now this museum, the castle, is going to be transformed into a kind of event organization. And it does so because the politicians press upon the people who organize this to make things funny. I mean, to make events to transform it into a theater practically, and so I think this is a pressure that eventisme, présentisme is really the most important threat to cultural heritage, because it's an acceleration. It's always time. It's an acceleration. It's putting into movement without any calm for reflection. We were talking about reflection, but there is no calm anymore for reflection in this context. And hence, I think the task of the academies could be, yes, to teach politicians, to teach the press also. This is very important because the press is a very important agent in this. To teach the press, keep calm. I mean, there is a museum, and perhaps the museum still has a function. So I would just, once more, I thank you very much. You pointed to the problem, but I just wanted to add something from my own experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The Humboldt Forum experience in Berlin is really an extremely good example for its very size, for the place where it is located, for all the historical memory it brings with it, including the destruction of the castle, both by bombing and by the DDR. So I think that, but it is again about the balance between entertainment and cultural heritage. Cultural heritage shouldn't be identified with entertainment, yet we should find a possible way of convincing politicians, and that's to us to say. We cannot expect from politicians or from local or national government or from European government to explain to us what we could do with our. But it is on us, on our shoulders, to invent, to create constantly new ways of making cultural heritage attractive without transforming it into just an opportunity for entertainment. These are very complex strategies that normally are exercised and experienced through exhibitions, through the exhibition policy. But the exhibition policy is again a very controversial theme. I only mentioned it, but let's just reflect on one point. On one hand, exhibitions, good exhibitions, are the only way to experience, to create the movement we are discussing now, making cultural heritage speak without becoming entertainment. On the other hand, exhibitions need moving objects from one place to another. And this is very controversial, because if you move sculptures or paintings from one place to another, they are at risk during the movement itself. So there are two different and contrasting ways of thinking about the very same thing. Another reason why, and I repeat, if you keep in mind the very long inflationary list of question marks I was beginning with, this is another reason why we should think about the different advantages and disadvantages of making exhibitions and rules of the game for exhibitions. There are most exhibitions, I think more than 90% of exhibitions are totally unuseful from a point of view, from an intellectual point of view. They don't say anything new. They are unable to speak. They are able only to confirm the very existence of great cultural icons. This is what's going to happen with Leonardo. There are going to be, I think, no less than 200 exhibitions about Leonardo in Europe. Probably, I hope that at least one of them will bring something new to the awareness and consciousness of European culture. But I doubt it.
Last question.
Okay, last question. Do you see any problem in the case of political parties taking into their propaganda element of protecting cultural heritage? And if yes, how Academy should prevent this trend? Thanks.
This is a very good question, really very good question. So I'm able to respond only within Italy. I will mention only a couple of facts from my own perspective. In my own perspective, for a while, has been also been chair of what is called in Italy Consiglio Superiore dei Beni Culturali. I mean the highest organization, consulting organization for the Ministry of Culture. 2 points. First, differences between different parties in Italy in this respect are minimal. This is something which is simply to be described. It doesn't need demonstration. It is, if you need demonstration, I can offer you a number of arguments in this respect. Second, up to now, over the last 30 years, where I've been active in this field, no Italian party of large or small size took cultural heritage and its preservation, landscape and its preservation, environment and its preservation as one of the main points of its program before elections. Third and last point I wanted to make, this doesn't necessarily mean that you don't find politicians who are really very sensitive, who can react very intelligently. And I tried it several times. I don't want to make names, to name names now because we don't have time to articulate this point very. But I had very good responses from both people on the right of the spectrum and on the left of the spectrum, and I had very bad responses or inability to listen from both sides. So I think that we have to keep fighting, and that if instead of individuals like myself or others, in a prestigious academy such as this, or a prestigious collection of academies such as ALLEA would say something important and make one of these points and arguing those points powerfully, as we should be able to do, I think this might be very, very important indeed.
Thank you very much.